All right, everyone, let's, with respect to all your time, what do we got? 5:33, we'll start this meeting on time. I'm sure the other people that are expected here this evening will be here shortly. We'll start with a roll call, please. Frank, if you would.
Thank you, Co-Chair Wasserman. Member Ames. I'm here. Thank you very much. Member.
Excuse me one sec. And for anybody, we've got microphone buttons to the right of your monitor on the little box. You just press the MIC and that there he is, turned it on.
Hi, I'm here.
Thank you very much. Member Kiala is absent. Co-Chair Cortese is absent at the moment. Member Gill is absent. Member Howard.
Here.
Thank you. Member Hutchison is absent. Member Kennett.
Here.
Thank you. Member O'Day.
Here.
Thank you. Member Prevetti.
Here.
Thank you. Dr. Smith is absent at the moment. Member Varela.
Here.
Thank you. And Co-Chair Wasserman.
Here.
Thank you very much. We have a quorum.
Thank you. We expect Supervisor Cortese shortly. And for the record, Bill Vito Kiala called me up, and he's harvesting some more mushrooms than he thought he would have, so was not able to get back here dealing with that issue. So that'll be our call to order. Next, item 2 is public comment, an opportunity for anybody to speak about anything not on today's agenda. Do we have any speaker cards? Do we have anyone interested? We have a speaker card here. Please come on forward. You'll have 3 minutes. You'll grab your card and then start your timer. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My name is Vicki Moore. I'm speaking as an individual. Because I have to leave shortly, my item does pertain to number 6, but I can't stay that long. So I'm wanting to commend the planning staff for their report on county land use policies and recognizing that it is, quote, one of the foundational principles of successful ag preservation programs, and that they prioritize and support ongoing use of ag lands and operations. And also to mention that it's difficult for ag preservation programs to succeed unless the underlying zoning and land use policies serve to strengthen farming and protect ag land from conversion to other uses. I served on the 1994 General Plan Advisory Committee, and I believe it's very important that the Ag Task Force members truly understand the importance of these policies. And at the same time, I agree that more can be done to strengthen the zoning districts, to further restrict non-agricultural supporting uses, expand ag zoning districts, and reduce conflicts between incompatible uses in ag. I'm also very glad that the staff report acknowledges the critically important role that LAFCO plays in protecting farmland from unnecessary urban expansion by stating that, quote, the potential for ag lands to be annexed into adjacent cities for urban development is a threat, and that this urban development not only results in the eventual direct loss of farming and ag lands, but also increases the speculative value of land within the ag area where urban development is proposed, which makes it very difficult to sustain any long-term farming operations. And I might add, also provides a major challenge to a successful ag easement purchase program. Just wanted to mention for the record, Santa Clara County's LAFCO is one of the best around. It's actually was named the most effective LAFCO in the state of California this year. It was LAFCO and the county were featured in the Office of Planning and Research document from October of this month from the governor's office on creating sustainable communities and landscapes. Santa Clara County was featured and the Santa Clara County LAFCO also was a prominent author of a report from this year on the state of the art on agricultural preservation. So I wanted to make that point because LAFCO is indeed critically important in this equation. And going forward, the success of the ag preservation effort is going to be depending on the county, LAFCO, the cities, affirming the importance of these policies, protecting farmland, and supporting all efforts, including ag easements, regulatory changes, policies, other support for a more robust farming economy and long-term investment in
Thank you, Ms. Moore.
agriculture.
Before you leave, question,
Thank
please. If, with your permission, just for the record, I changed the agenda item to number 6 on your speaker card.
That's perfectly
Is that all right
fine.
with
I
you?
appreciate that very much.
I just
Just a
wanted-
time constraint I had.
No problem. I just wanted to make sure. Supervisor, she was speaking on item number 6, was unable to stay for longer. Thank you. All right with you, we'll continue on with the agenda. Thank you. We move on to item number 3, stakeholder comments. Any comments to be made by anybody here? There, you got your lights on, your light on. Do you wish to speak? Nope. Anybody else this time? Mr. Varela, your light's on?
It is.
All right. Thank you very much. That'll conclude item number 3, stakeholder comments. We'll move to item number 4, which is approval of the consent calendar, which tonight includes items 8 and 9. Do we have any speakers on 8 and 9? Nope. Committee members, any motion?
Move to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Frank, you getting that? Okay, so we have a motion to approve and a second. Any discussion about either item? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. We now move on to item number 5, considering recommendations from the Department of Planning and Development relating to the right to farm in Santa Clara County. Gentlemen.
Hello, Michael Meehan, Senior Planner and Program Manager for the Ag Plan. Can you pop those slides up for me? All right, so we're here to go over briefly the current state of the right to farm in Santa Clara County and some modest measures that we're proposing to strengthen it. So we're just going to situate this again as we have with most measures that come to you. This originated in the Santa Clara Valley Agricultural Plan. This one is pretty squarely within the land use policy area, although it pertains greatly to our conversation last month about awareness raising, as you'll see later. Specifically, Objective 4 speaks to the desire to strengthen a Right to Farm Act or Right to Farm ordinance here, reducing conflict between incompatible uses in agriculture within the agricultural areas. The Ag Plan calls out strengthening right to farm requirements, specifically looking to draft revisions to the ordinance in the county that would bolster them, specifically noting that it already does have a right to farm ordinance, but that we could possibly do more. And so this report is a result of looking into that. So a quick overview. Our right to farm policy is pretty typical of many. If you're unfamiliar with right to farm policies, what they usually do is they define agriculture, agricultural uses, and say that any generally accepted and typical uses of agricultural land for agricultural purposes cannot be found as a nuisance, or rather are not as a nuisance. The department is proposing to replicate extra measures that have been taken in other counties around California, and I'll get into that in 1 minute. So what are these policies? They're at the state and the local level. That definition of agriculture outside of nuisance is really the providence of the state. And here in California, we do have a state law that provides a legal defense against these allegations. And typically what we're talking about is dust in a swimming pool, or odors wafting over from a cow operation, or residue rotting in the fields. And so often what we're talking about is the urban edge entering into pre-existing agricultural areas, and the difficulty of that interface results potentially in legal lawsuits. And so the goal at the state level is to provide a legal defense. Of course, you cannot stop someone from filing a lawsuit, but typically if a lawsuit is filed, the farmer is not found to have created a nuisance to their neighbors. At the local level, the goal of right to farm policies is really about raising awareness, and the chief way that they do that is through requiring disclosures. Now you'll see at the end, providing dispute mediation and resolution procedures is offered as a fig leaf, as a kind of alternative to legal resolution, although in most cases, while this does exist, including in Santa Clara County, it's not often taken advantage of. So the two principal areas, again, are at the state level, providing some legal defense, and then at the local level to raise awareness and require disclosures. So here we already have, as I've stated, California law explicitly defining typical agricultural use. If you have exceptional circumstances, it may be considered a nuisance, but typical agricultural uses do not constitute a nuisance. And they also call out for local governments to create their own right to farm ordinances that provide this educational or awareness raising measure. So we in Santa Clara County require only real estate transfer disclosure, and we've deployed no other educational efforts or awareness raising means. So a quick look in the report, there are a number of counties. As an attachment, there are even more to the report. Here I've just highlighted two other counties and the measures that are taken around disclosure specifically. So as we see here, real estate transactions on the right, fairly typical of all right to farm programs, including our own, where there's a signed disclosure between buyer and seller. There's a lot of paperwork at this point of a transaction, and Commissioner Kennett was kind enough to share his process with me. In these moments, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of information that's coming at you, and it's not necessarily the ideal moment to be learning about the agricultural practices that have and will continue to operate in your area. So while it's fairly common for real estate transactions to be a part of right to farm disclosures, they're not necessarily the most effective. As ancillary measures, development permitting as well as property tax bills are two other vehicles for providing disclosure. As you see here, Sonoma and Napa both deploy these measures. The property tax bill is targeting a different audience. So if the real estate transaction is targeting an audience of a prospective purchaser of real property, the property tax bill is addressing and reminding existing real property owners of their proximity to agriculture, of the importance of agriculture, and of the determination that typically agricultural uses cannot be considered a nuisance. The development permitting is a third audience that is being targeted. So there, in Sonoma and Napa, for example, you will have the planning department or the county recorder record the disclosure to anyone seeking a subdivision or building or construction within 1 mile of active agricultural lands to give them the awareness as well. So the idea is to create a pipeline from the developer to the prospective purchaser to the existing homeowner, so that everyone is aware of the priority and the value of agriculture, working lands in that area, and an understanding that the typical activities of agriculture do not constitute a nuisance. So our recommendations are very simple. We're looking to create an addition of 2 new audiences, those 2 that I just mentioned, existing real property owners within the ARA, the agricultural resource area as defined by the agricultural plan, and those seeking development approval with the department for within the ARA. So what's been done in many other counties is that the existing property owners, again, will be contacted through their annual property tax assessment or their property tax bill, and through the department, we would be able to create a disclosure requirement for any development approval that came to us. Now, for both of those, as well as for the real estate brokers and the prospective purchasers, we think that developing some educational materials, something that is not a block of legalese on a piece of paper that requires their signature at the bottom, but something that depicts really what we're talking about when we're talking about agricultural activity, to spell out some of the things that they might be able to expect, as well as using it as an opportunity to educate them about the benefits of living near working lands as well. We think that this could be a good complement for us internally to develop to, again, target all three of these audiences. So our proposed next steps are pretty simple. We're hoping internally to develop a disclosure program for the two new audiences. And again, that would be done most likely the tax department or the assessor's department, as well as within the Department of Planning, to create a protocol around these two new audiences for disclosure, preparing educational materials, which should be an easy tag on to the ongoing efforts as were highlighted in the last month's meeting. And we think that in keeping with a number of the other counties, Sonoma's ordinance, I believe, was attached to the report here, that the best course of action is to codify these measures with an amendment to the ordinance to our existing right to farm provisions, requiring that the assessor or the tax department shall provide this information and requiring that the department shall also provide that disclosure to these other new audiences. And I believe that's what I've got. Any questions?
Thank you. Chair Cortese, do you want to? Okay. Don't have any cards on this. Any public comment? Gordon, want to come up? Thank you. Good
My name's
evening.
Gordon Jacoby. I represent the Mariani family, whose land is 95% surrounded by urbanization, and is visited constantly with request that somehow right to farm kind of ordinance cannot deal with. When there are problems that occur because you're surrounded, they're going to happen. Strange thing, for my first job, I was the A-Bag airport person. I couldn't stop the noise over airports. So we had to work deals with Oakland and San Francisco. The noise didn't go away. Didn't really make them feel a lot better that they had some ordinance. But certain things happen, and you have to live with that. I would encourage you, and right now you have a problem with your plan and your ARA, as you're including some sites, there will be guaranteed forever to have conflicts because they're surrounded. And those are absolutely places you shouldn't try to be preserving forever. In many cases, because there's other public policy that asks them to do other things. On the Mariani property, a county road is supposed to go through it. A sidewalk for nearby schools are supposed to go through it. A water district pipeline was supposed to go through this. All urban infrastructure because it's surrounded. So in looking at your plan and looking at your right to farm, you can't go around creating the problem that then you pretend a right to farm is to resolve. The best thing is to don't try to preserve sites that are surrounded, because that puts the farmer in a guaranteed spot of long-term problems. In the Mariani's case, every time they spray, new state law now doesn't let them spray at certain times because they're next to the school. Experiences with next-door neighbors, a pregnant woman, very concerned, first child, comes over and talks to Andy. Andy's a terrific guy, and he says, I'll postpone it. All of a sudden, they're spraying in the middle of the night. The next-door neighbor says, wait a minute, what are you doing out in that field in the middle of the night? Those are problems because government has made a decision to surround them. Those you can't do. Out in fringes, very much so. So in looking at how you do your plan, understand right to farm is kind of a weak tool, but you're creating real problems when you're trying to preserve land that's surrounded by recognized conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Seeing none. Commission members. We'll start with Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you for the report on right to farm. A couple of questions related to that is I think the annual notice that the assessor would include to property owners is really, really critical. My experience has been it's true. They rarely, if ever, go to mediation, but there are the basis for the conversations that occur out in the field between growers or between the agricultural commissioner and property owners and neighbors. You mentioned in the report that both City of Gilroy and City of Morgan Hill echo the county provisions for right to farm. Would the assessor notification apply just to unincorporated parcels, or is there a way to include the property owners in those interface areas within city limits of Morgan Hill or Gilroy, being that they already echo those requirements?
Yeah, I believe that the county, the Department of Tax that sends those out, and they would be able to send it out to everyone in that designated area, including the residents of Gilroy and Morgan Hill.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Alex?
Well done for our conversation, but there's a couple of items missing I'd like to bring forth. You're mentioning basically that the notification is going to go, and education, if you will only go to people on the tax roll, homeowners. But lately, because of the way housing is changing in all over this county, but certainly in Morgan Hill and Gilroy, there's probably more renters moving in, and they also need to be notified. Even though they're in a townhouse and maybe not directly within a mile of active agriculture, the reality is in Morgan Hill and Gilroy, it isn't so much the dust and the spraying, it's the downwind effect from the garlic and the chicken farm, the mushroom farms. And as anybody knows who lives in that area, if you want to marinate a steak, just put it on your clothesline overnight when the wind is blowing up from Gilroy. And then the other area is people who are leasing commercial property and also owning commercial property. But if those owners are going to get the same notification, the lessee should. And they have the same complaints. And they go to work in the morning and wondering what that god-awful smell is. And it's not a cow operation. So that's our main concern. We hear it. We try to tell people about it. And as I explained during our conversation, the form is fine, but it's one page out of 110 other pages that they have to review and sign and initial and everything in order to close the transaction. It's slightly better with commercial transactions, but it's not a requirement on commercial transactions. It's really up to the agent, such as myself, whether to disclose it or not, which I tend to. Or I write it into the lease and the PSA, the purchase sales agreement, and the LOI, the letter of intent, to either lease or purchase. So don't forget them. Thank you.
And Alex, before we go to Laurel, we're talking about raising public awareness. I think as this right to farm plan develops, however it may be in certain properties, in and not, and all of that happening, I think perhaps a presentation to the South County Realtors Association, the Morgan Hill Realtors, the Gilroy Realtors, perhaps be a guest speaker at one of your meetings.
Absolutely.
Might be helpful to add to the list, the outreach. You were talking about the tax assessor, tax department, you were talking about your own planning department. I think the realtors would make sense too, because most property purchases people do one or two times in a lifetime. The realtors, disclosure, it's just going to be another form that they're going to need to have in their packet. And I think that would be a positive thing.
That's how it is now. They're aware of it. Essentially, you're preaching to the choir by talking to the realtors. And I can honestly say not all of them have the disclosure. It's kind of a secondary thing. There's no standard form. The one I sent you is probably as standard as it is.
And perhaps a one-page boilerplate form could be part of the asbestos, the lead paint, the blah, 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 blah.
That's a CAR form. That's the California Association of Realtors form. So the state would have to get involved in that.
Oh, that I don't want.
Yeah, we don't want that. So let's keep it local and make it a special form, surround,
Okay.
put a yellow border on it or something so it stands out. But also, as you know, Supervisor Wasserman, it's in the middle of 110 pages of stuff.
Yep.
And as often as not these days, you don't sit there and explain it to them. You send it over the internet, and all they do is hit sign, initial, and then it's over with. And if you ask any of them what they just signed or initialed,
I think, but having it in the packet, though, at least gets some of the burden off the Realtor for disclosure.
I agree.
And that's all. And then
It's
it's
not
up to the
there yet.
people to read. Yep. Laurel.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the report and the public comment, and also the comments of the colleagues here on the task force. I would just ask that if we are going to be expanding the right to farm and the disclosures, especially the annual disclosures, that we not limit it to the agricultural resource area. There are other farming locations within Santa Clara County where right to farm should also be disclosed. So I would recommend that we look at this in a broader context beyond just the agricultural resource area. Thank you.
Jane.
Thank you, and thanks for the report. Following up on Alex's comment, we were recently notified by Expedia that Gilroy was named as one of the top 10 smelliest cities in the country, and we just embraced that. And we just sent out a big post, and it was the most viewed post, so proud of that garlic smell.
As well you should be.
Thank you. Anyway, my question has to do with the educational materials. Can you expand a bit about what you're actually saying there? And do you have a model or examples that other counties are using? And how that actually gets to the folks?
Yeah, sure. So that's not something actually that we've seen or that we're building off of from other counties, but it is, I think, an easy tag on to the other efforts that we're doing, whether it's the signage program or the website that we're developing, the various educational materials that are mostly talking about the benefits of working lands, the benefits of agriculture in your region. We're thinking it would be very easy to create a pamphlet or some form that you can imagine accompanying a disclosure that if we were to give a presentation, we could leave them with a stack of pamphlets, for example. And it would not only talk about the benefits of agriculture, but it would also talk about, these are the things to expect. These are why you might smell this thing, or this is why you might see these things, or some sort of soft and accessible education on a basic level, but there's no real model, and we're very much open to any suggestions or feedback, because I think we're making it up as we go.
I know my thought was to be sharing and utilize the expertise at the Santa Clara County Farm Bureau. I think they would be a good partner for helping to produce that.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Larry.
Yes.
No, I'm doing Larry now. We'll back to you.
Okay,
John.
fine, thank you. So first off, I think you should sign the form when you transfer, because if you don't sign it, you just get a stack, you put it away. So I do remember signing that thing about the lead and the asbestos, even though it was 30-some years ago. I like the idea of when you do the subdivision or building permits or whatever, I think that's a good thing. I think you should send this to everybody in the county, not just this area here. A simple little pamphlet, simply saying this is Santa Clara County is an agricultural area, and promote the agriculture, and then mention that there's this rules here, because not everybody reads this stuff. So when you go down to visit, when I go down and visit my friend in Morgan Hill and he complains about the dust in the swimming pool, I can say, hey, I remember getting something in the mail last year that referred to the county website. So just raise awareness every place. Don't make it a lot of legalese, so just make a simple graphic that's colorful, that'll catch your attention, a little half page in your annual thing. Also, do the different county supervisors have a newsletter that they send out regularly? I know some of them do. Maybe you could include a little article there, or maybe have flyers at the libraries.
Yep, we can certainly do that.
And then also, on the flip side, the right to agriculture, are there limits on that too? I mean, are there limits? I mean, I'm thinking if you have a pig farm, can you put the pig pool right at the property line right next to the residential areas? Or are there limits as to where that can go? Are there limits as to what the airplanes can fly for spraying, and what the drift from the other areas? I mean, there is a limit on both sides, I hope, on this thing.
Okay, we'll direct that to Kirk. God, I did it again. Rob, sorry.
He must be somewhere here.
Yeah.
I'd just say hold that thought. We'll talk about land use and zoning with the next item on sort of what's allowed in
'Cause
that
I think
area
that
as
includes
important.
buffers.
And we do talk about buffer
And setbacks
types
and-
of uses.
Okay. I will also say that a lot of it has to do with the jurisprudence of an area. So, for example, the pig farms in North Carolina are able to get away with a lot of stuff because of the right to farm law, but that doesn't really have to do with the right to farm law. That has more to do with the rulings interpreting one thing as a nuisance or not. So that doesn't totally pertain to this, but it is an important concern.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chair. So one of the comments that I wanted to share with you is at the monthly Santa Clara County Farm Bureau meetings, our Ag Commissioner, Joe Davini, gives us a very thorough update as to the activities with the farm activity in South County. And one of the concerns that he shared recently with us is the school districts that are adjacent to farms that are spraying have complained. And so what they're complaining about is the spray, again, is causing some, I guess, some problems for the students. So the farmers are now looking at changing their schedules, and adjacent to the farms and the schools are also homes. So the farmers are being impacted quite severely, I think, in their schedule of being able to irrigate or fertilize, and also placing pesticides. So this is another area that perhaps maybe, Rob, you can give us comments on that as to how can we mitigate with that in those particular areas. And that's pretty much throughout South County, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy schools.
Yeah, I do know, and I'm not sure, I don't think our agricultural commissioner here, but there is recent state law that requires notification and timing of pesticide spraying around schools. And basically, it's another land use compliance issue that I know a lot of farmers are struggling with because they adjust their timing, and we know of one case where they adjust their timing to avoid school hours, but then it has them having to spray at nighttime where adjacent neighbors will complain. So it's another nuisance area.
Thank you.
And again, a lot of that, as was brought up by Gordon earlier, is because of the growth, similar to an airport, okay, where the growth has encroached upon, so that spraying and it didn't used to affect homes. It didn't used to affect schools. You know, the farmers were there first. And so that's a tough issue. Supervisor.
Thank you. So I'm certainly quite familiar with the concept and the dilemma, and the representative from Mariani was talking about having worked agricultural land that was basically already surrounded by development in a couple of cases by the time I was 11 or 12 years old, and then as an adult watching it become surrounded by development and watching infrastructure like was described earlier coming in, where so much of the land was lost just by eminent domain, flood control projects, schools that said they wanted to build, school districts that wanted to build schools, and then later sold to developers. So all of a sudden you had houses next to your orchard instead of a school. So I got a million war stories about that. Probably the biggest war story I have about this kind of a situation has nothing to do with farming the land. It has to do with this issue of the disclosure requirements. And I don't know if, I wouldn't expect Laurel Pavetti to remember this, but when I was on the San Jose City Council, I tried to add a disclosure requirement in the city that simply was to disclose which street trees were supposed to be in the park strip, or basically wasn't even that, whether there was one missing that was originally there. The issue wasn't about whether one should save trees or not, just like the issue with this, I think with organizations like SCORE, not necessarily individual realtors, won't be whether or not you should preserve agriculture or not. It's going to be this issue about another form. And I don't want to gloss over what Mr. Kennett was saying, is the CAR package is sort of universal to everyone. It's what they use. And so as soon as you add in a local form, it does raise the hackles of folks who don't want to be responsible or liable. And I'm not saying that they should be. I'm just saying they feel an extra burden in having to make sure that that form that isn't part of the ordinary package gets included as part of that escrow. So, and then getting people to just sign off, because they do need to sign off. I mean, they need to acknowledge it. And even though it's a disclosure, it's an educational tool, it just requires a simple signature, it's considered a point of sale burden by the industry itself. So I don't know if we have, and maybe that part went right over my head in terms of presentation, if our current ordinance has any disclosure sign-off requirements at all like that.
Yeah, the state and the local ordinance, the state law as well as the local ordinance, both currently require it. But again, it's totally up to the momentary discretion. Although it is legally required as it stands in the state law.
In the state law, but that would be part of the same California Association of Realtors standard package deposit. We used to call it a deposit receipt, like somebody said it's now 200 forms or something.
The gray area, the reason why I don't think it is a part of that is because it's if you're within 1 mile of an agricultural operation. So I don't think it is included. It sounded from my conversations with Task Force member Kenneth that wasn't necessarily included, and it's kind of up to the individual to create it. So the burden is upon the realtor to know, is this property within 1 mile radius? And the burden is also on them to submit that disclosure. So that's enough gray area without it, again, being recorded anywhere. So I think a lot of folks don't do it, but it is currently both required by state law and then reinforced with the requirement
by the county ordinance.
By the county, yeah.
But we don't have a form for them to use. It's just
there's stock language. So there's not a form, but there is stock language that says you must include this paragraph.
So the Board of Supervisors approves these amendments, these further recommendations. It's simply going to modify that language to some degree.
Yeah, okay. and it would be adding these other audiences, which again would not put the burden would be on the county. It would be on the Department of Planning and the Department of Tax and Collection. So,
in the spirit of transparency, I think that Santa Clara County Association of Realtors has to be reached out to and told that these changes are being considered, not to try to create pushback, but I just think, again, in the spirit of transparency, if we just run this up to the Board of Supervisors, which I'm in favor of, and we should do that, because I think there's time to reach out to them, and modify the language. It's like the tree falling in the forest that nobody hears. Right. Two bad things will happen. One, there'll be even less people who know what the language is really supposed to be or including it. And secondly, I don't think it's good government for us to, be establishing burdens that affect 7,000 or 8,000 realtors in Santa Clara County without giving them an opportunity to be heard. They might have some good suggestions about it besides kill it, because I think that will be, the default. We in general, and again, present company intended, present company accepted, we don't, as an industry, prefer any additional forms for things like this, that especially if they're separate from whatever the state's doing in general. Once you get beyond that, maybe there's some good ideas about, we think the Board of Supervisors is going to do this anyway. Thank you very much for your input. Now, how would you like it to look? Would you prefer a form that's standardized by the legal department, at the county? I think that's what the city did. Ultimately, we went through a rather controversial series of discussions about the ordinance I was talking about, but it did get enacted. But part of what was requested was that the city actually come up with a standard form. As much as everybody hated having to include another form, the response was, well, at least if the form is simple and it just says yes or no, we're aware of this, we can live with it. I mean, that ultimately was the response. So I just want to encourage that outreach. And thanks for asking the questions, because answering these questions about what we already require, because I wasn't absolutely clear on that. It was interesting, another personal anecdote. I didn't realize this the first time I looked through the packet, and this is kind of scary, but Al Socolow, who was one of the writers of the University of California issues brief that was included in our packet, taught me local government at UC Davis. and now he's talking about agricultural buffer zones and the like. So interesting that he's still around. But I think he does agree with our public speaker in the fact, among the many things that they're saying is that these are primarily educational tools, and all the work they've done, doesn't lead to a conclusion that this is going to help a great deal. And I do think it's because of some of the things that were cited before, again, just from my own experience, issues about cost of water, issue about availability of water, issues about how many people are stealing your crops, frankly, I hate to put it that way, once you're surrounded by urbanization, interest about how many visits you can handle from the public about dust and, irrigation that encroaches on the street a little bit and all these different things, usually end up causing, if not the current farmers to want to quit, the next generation says, I don't want any part of that. Just like a lot of people wouldn't choose politics for a vocation in my family. So I do think this is good. I'm for it, and thank you. And I was, briefed on it ahead of time. But I think the realtors need to be reached out to, as well as the Farm Bureau. And I hopefully will be in a position with the Board of Supervisors, if anyone asks any questions, to just, really emphasize the fact that this is an education tool that will complement the other things that we're trying to do, which are much bigger, like the agricultural easements. This is a complementary tool. Thank you. If you object to any of that, please don't hesitate. That's just a personal opinion.
No, I think that the more buy-in that we can get and the more participation and at the earlier stage as possible, the more successful this will be, because there's nothing we can do to change the fact that it still rests on the brokers themselves to convey this information. And so if they feel like they're not co-creating it or understanding it in any way, I think will be ineffectual.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you, Supervisor Wasserman.
Thank you. On package page 4, you've got recommended actions A and B. Receive the report. Liz Ann, I've always made it a practice. Receiving report doesn't need a vote. Do you agree?
If you want to take formal action to receive the report, then you do have to have a motion. But if you can just listen to the report and not officially receive it.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to address A and B separately, and I'd like to make the motion that we receive the report, then have some comments about Part B. If there's a seconder for that. Thank you. Second for that. Any discussion? All in favor of receiving the report, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. That passes unanimously. Jane, did you have a comment? No. Now move on to item number B, forward recommendations. When I read that and when I've heard from all the various people up here, you've got a current slide up there right now, and you should all, so you got rid of it. Right then. There it was. It's gone? Now it's back. Okay. Who's ever messing with me? That's funny. So I see on this proposed next steps, and I tie that in with forward recommendations. So A is first bullet, develop disclosure program for 2 new audiences within the administration. That's planning and the tax department. I'm certainly in favor of that. B, prepare educational materials within outgoing outreach and communications campaign. I think you've heard a variety of opinions, be it the realtors, be it various associations, wherever you think, emails, newsletters, whatever, through city governments, whatever it may be. I'm in favor of that. Codify these measures with an ordinance. Rob, I'm not sure what we'd be forwarding to the board as a recommendation regarding an ordinance. I know we've got the California Association of Realtors, we've got the Silicon Valley, we've got the local South County, Morgan Hill, Gilroy, et cetera, the local associations. It's now up to 105 pages of disclosures. I've also heard that a lot of what we're proposing is already state law. The 1 mile radius, all of that. I've got 2 concerns here. One is how much more red tape of any type does this government need to put on what already exists? If there are laws already and some realtors choose not to disclose it, that's on them. I'm just concerned about anything we're proposing adding, as Supervisor Cortese said, point of sale burden any further burdens. I'm in agreement with your A and B. I'm in agreement with increasing our outreach in half a dozen different ways. We've got a lot of partners here between newsletters, between the realtors, between our various organizations. We can help do all that. Between the cities, we can do that. Can you briefly tell me what it is you have in mind that we're forwarding to the Board of Supervisors for approval as far as changing anything, any law?
Sure. So the two additional, I don't think it would change the realtors. It was the two additional outreach mechanisms Michael mentioned. One was asking the planning department to go ahead and disclose this in the permits they issue, and two was to have it on the tax forms. And
Yep,
originally,
that's bullet one, and I'm in agreement with that. It's bullet 3 that I'm concerned about.
right, it was codifying those. Originally, we thought that's training and education of the departments to do so. It's been my sort of observation over time that you train folks on doing that, and if it's not codified into their policies, it drifts away. So the ordinance revision would just only direct that those disclosures happen at the planning department and
Super.
at the tax bill.
Thank you. If that's the extent of what we're being asked to forward to the board at this time, and we're being asked to this committee, I'm totally for that.
That's
As far
correct.
as codifying the first bullet. That's number one. Number two, Mr. Jacoby spoke about Mariani Farms. Do you have the ability through your department to go through on a case-by-case? I mean, I know we have this right to farm. We talked about a 1 mile distance. We talked about the protection that gives farmers. But then you have situations, and I'll just pick Mariana Farms because that was brought up tonight. You have situations where a farm was there, and then over the years, development, schools, et cetera, pipelines, roads have encroached upon that. Do you see that we have the ability on a case-by-case, application-by-application to say, because of what's taken place over the years, see, Rob, what I'm trying to say, and I'm saying poorly, is that particular instance that was brought up is kind of between a rock and a hard place. Because you've got development that's encroached all around them, limiting what they can do as far as spray and everything else. Yet they've got a right to farm, yet I get a lot of complaints. The mushroom farm is an entirely different thing as far as the odor going. Do you have any comments that you can make addressing the one public speaker we had this evening?
Well, there's two sides to it. I mean, the right to farm, part of it, I think, is our attempt to disclose to those folks who surround Mr. Mariani's property or others that he has rights to continue his operations. That's the principal heart. And focus on the education, be it through their tax bill or through the permits that they get issued. And I think Mr. Jacoby spoke to a land use issue long term. I cannot speak to that tonight. It might
Okay.
come up on the next item, but the question would be if there's a intent for a land use change on that property, which would be a separate matter.
Okay, thank you. I'll look forward to that. I'd be happy to make the motion regarding B that simply says I make a motion to codify these measures, which is increasing outreach with the two new audiences, specifically Planning Department and the tax assessor.
Yeah, I'll second it for discussion. Supervisor Wasserman, I just want to
Please.
clarify that what I was suggesting, which doesn't necessarily have to be part of the motion, I just want to make sure there's not objection to it, is that between now and bringing the red line version to the Board of Supervisors for adoption,
Yeah,
which is really just an amended ordinance that already exists, that there's some outreach done so that can be reported back to us as in terms of the effectiveness of the disclosures as, you know, in actual practice with realtors. And I think what's been clarified is further by Rob is that, you know, they're not going to have to go tell them that we're making substantive disclosure changes or proposing new disclosures in this ordinance, but that while we're amending the ordinance, we thought it would be a nice time to check in with them and ask them how effective or how frequent the disclosures are really occurring and what ideas they might have about that. I just think it's a great opportunity because I think once we pass this, you know, these fairly minor amendments to this ordinance, it's going to go back into the books and it may be a long time before anyone ever takes this up with external stakeholders like the realtors again.
Thank you.
I
I
just
think,
want to make sure that
I think the
outreach is
transparency is very important, that the outreach be included. And all I'm proposing in this measure is and after an open and public hearing and soliciting people to come in and speak, is that we simply increase our outreach via those two new audiences, tax and planning. That's all. I'm not proposing any more burden of any type on property owners. Jane, do you have, no? Anybody else? Any other comments?
Actually, I did have a question. It has to do a little bit about the timeline. When we're making this recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, does it allow you enough time to do that outreach? And
yeah.
what is that time frame that's typically it comes back? I just wanted to verify too that that was occurring, so.
We can simply make the motion that outreach must be done before it's.
Got it.
That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah, but again, and this is not, Rob, what got me was the subject line of the report said strengthening the right to farm in Santa Clara County. Okay, and I was not at this time ready to strengthen that in any way. I am prepared to increasing outreach, but that was the extent of my motion.
That's a correct characterization.
Thank you. Any other comments? I'll call for the question. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you. Move on to item number 6.
Okay, so there were some questions on land use, and so now we'll talk about land use. If the clerk could put the PowerPoint up for item 6. And so I know this has been a requested item on the work plan for a couple months now, and I know just as a precursor, the task force has received correspondence, which I think we've added from the cities of Gilroy and Morgan Hill, and I know there's some stakeholders that have submitted correspondence, and just want to direct your attention to those if needed as we present this. So land use and support for agriculture. I'll start off by saying, and most folks know this, and especially the planners in the room, really the foundation of agricultural preservation programs usually does reside with land use and zoning. If you don't have your land use tools that prioritize that the land should be used for agriculture, most of these other tools that we've talked about really are ineffective. So the foundation really resides with those. And I'm happy to say that for over 20 years, the county has had my editorial comment, very solid agricultural support principles in its general plan that recognize the importance of agriculture and have pretty protectionist land use requirements on what can and happen and how agricultural property is subdivided. Tonight we're going to look at sort of sharpening those tools. That's just to set the stage. Just to walk you through the outline, a quick overview on our existing general plan zoning. A lot of what you're going to hear tonight comes from that outreach we did for 2 years and listened to farmers and what went into the ag plan on the challenges they have and how could sharpen those tools. And I'll walk you through each of the zoning modifications we're recommending. And then we'll end with just a bit of timing. We are proposing a staging to this, and then a discussion on other factors that are outside the county zone zoning ordinance, which is urban annexations and LAFCO. So the county does have 2 agricultural zoning districts. They're the agricultural large scale, which encompasses those largest properties which are most conducive to large scale commercial operations. Those are usually properties over 40, 60, 80 acres. Namely, we find those in the areas south and east of Gilroy and in parts of Coyote Valley. We have agricultural medium scale, again, very good farmland property. The properties in those areas are typically smaller and not as conducive to large-scale operations, but again, have all the ingredients to support agriculture. Again, generally these districts are you find in Coyote Valley, in and around Morgan Hill, and in the areas in and around Gilroy. Some of the challenges that we've heard, despite having these strong agricultural zoning districts, again, which limit the type of uses allowed, which have a minimum lot size, which is very large, 20 to 40 acres, is there's ongoing challenges to agricultural operations, even if you operate a farming operation in these areas. One trend we've observed, and we've heard this from at least one city and some other stakeholders, is many of the smaller parcels in the agricultural areas are not being used for agricultural purpose, and often rural residential estate homes are built on these and built to a size and scale to which agriculture is not viable. So while the zoning prioritizes agriculture, typically you'll find a landform or it's large estate residential properties instead. We do have agricultural urban interface issues, which we talked about, some which happen even within the ag areas, and we'd like to talk about perhaps some changes in the ag zones to deal with those, and that also has to deal with non-compatible uses that presently are allowed in some of our agricultural districts. And then finally, in terms of regulatory reform, we recognize that we have agricultural supportive uses for which we are requiring use permits, other permits, to which if we took a hard look at that and we want to support the infrastructure of agriculture and they're in agricultural districts, takes a good rational look at perhaps streamlining the permitting for those. So to summarize, and I'll go through each of these point by point, but we have 5 recommended modifications to our county zoning ordinance. One is to look at sizes of homes in ag districts and to have a review process to make sure they don't turn an ag property into a rural residential property, that ag can still exist on that property, number one. Number two, take a look again at some of the land uses we allowed in ag districts, those that don't have a direct support role or could provide a conflict for agriculture, and consider not allowing those in those districts. Number 3, ag buffers, speaks very much to the urban farm interface issues and the right to farm we just talked about. Oftentimes, a new land use will go in and the farmer has to accommodate. We'd like to have the new land use accommodate for the farming. Number 4, look at streamlining permitting for some of these ag supportive uses in our ag zoning districts. And then finally, we've recognized that there's a lot of areas where farming is happening. They're just in zoning districts that don't support it, so we could actually consider expanding our agricultural zoning districts. So point by point, the first one in this, out of the tools we're looking at, would be one that would create a new land use tool to address an issue where farmland is being converted, is the rural rancheting of agricultural lands. So throughout the ag plan preparation process, we did hear from stakeholders that principally in the ag medium scale areas in and around Morgan Hill, a lot of parcels of 5 to 10 acres which have an agricultural zoning were subject to, I'll just get a state residential development. They were advertised for sale not as agricultural property, but as a potential rural residential house. And as the county doesn't have house size limitations, houses are often built that would take up a majority of the property. The property is zoned agriculture, it's intended for agriculture, but de facto, outside of these zoning tools, the property would become a rural residential property, which really doesn't leave room for farming and leave room for the ability of the property to be used for agriculture.
Excuse me, Rob, on that particular picture, is the lot size between the white lines?
That is correct,
Okay,
and thanks for the clarification.
Would you say that's roughly, between the road and everything else, roughly a 25% floor area ratio?
Yeah, on the screen, I'd say roughly what you're seeing is both the house and the development around it. I'd say roughly it appears to take up about 1/3 of the property. And it just compromises the ability to farm the rest of it. So we did look at some tools. There are some other counties that have waded into this issue. And again, it's not a tool that's a subdivision issue. These are usually pre-existing legal lots that were created 20, 40, 30 years ago prior to our modern zoning requirements. And we found a few in Santa Barbara County and elsewhere where they have some size restrictions. The tool that we're proposing for consideration is a design review threshold for new homes, and this would be for larger homes. We did consider a tool of having a maximum house size or having a maximum development size, but it seemed since the driving issue on these was large estate homes, a good way to review those would be if a house over a certain size was proposed, design review or planning approval would be required. And with that would be the opportunity to set standards, thresholds, ensure that that house does not impair the ability of the lot to be used for agriculture, could require that there be a documented agricultural use on the property, and there could be some findings regarding the location of the house on the property.
And Rob, if I may, the 5,000 to 7,000 square feet, you're talking about surface area. You're not saying above, below, basement, second story.
That's a good question, Supervisor Wasserman. I don't think we've put intelligence yet into sort of a footprint versus a total floor area.
Okay, because if you had 3,500 above and 3,500 below, that's 7,000. That's altogether different than 7,000 square foot footprint.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So what I can do, I can go ahead and pause in each one. I know we have a couple tools to discuss, and with this, I think, again, facilitate perhaps task force feedback on each and every tool, but the first one was to consider a design review threshold, to consider larger homes, and with that would be a finding or perhaps criteria and requirements that they be cited to avoid impacts to agriculture and perhaps require an active agricultural use on the property.
Thank you. And before we get committee response, anyone from the public wish to speak on this item? Seeing none. Oh, Gordon? And as usual on the committee, if you wish to speak, please turn on your mic button and your red light will light up, just like that.
On this topic, we've kind of certainly beat it up in Morgan Hill because 120 years ago it was subdivided into 10-acre lots when small farms were 10 acres. Made sense at that time. Things have changed. You can't really compete on 10 acres. If you would look, for example, just go for the fun of it at Google and look at automation, ag automation, kinds of equipment that is now being contemplated for spraying or picking can best be done on 100 acres. Farmers on 10 can't really compete on that, can't afford that. So yet we started looking at, well, who can afford this? Well, you look in Livermore, look in a variety of places. What happens is very wealthy people can do it. They buy a estate, put some grapes on it. They want a house at about 20% of the lot size. And they aren't looking at economics, which is what we want. We don't want them to think about economics. We want them to put green stuff on and not compare themselves to where it's being done by automation at very cost-sensitive market conditions. So in starting to look at, if you're sizing homes, remember who you're trying to aim it for, and remember what your goals are. If your goals are to get green stuff on that land, then pay attention to who are the people that are going to buy that. I mean, 7,000 square feet is that's a little extreme, but I think looking more at the size of the set-aside, 20%, and then not being too excited about the size of a house. You want somebody there who's going to spend the money to make the improvements and the green stuff and farm it. Maybe bring in somebody to lease it to do it. Those are the things that you're after. Size of the house is not that important.
Thank you. Another speaker? Please come up and introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Eli Zegas. I'm the Food and Agriculture Policy Director at Spur. Good to be talking to you. And want to really thank staff for the work you all have did in this report. I think it raises a lot of the same points that came out of the Ag Plan and taking it a step further, like what would that look like? To the previous comment, as the Ag Plan was being developed, I forwarded to the Planning Department and the Open Space Authority a couple names of farmers who do see a viability for something of 10 acres in size. Certainly there are farmers who operate at a much larger scale, and that is one way of having a business model. But I would say, at least from a couple conversations I had, there are other business models that look to selling to local markets with a higher premium perhaps. They're not hobby farmers, they are real farmers, and the one I spoke to, his parents, he is an immigrant or his parents are immigrants, and he's looking to sell to local markets. So to not write off the idea that there could be smaller scale agriculture at 10 acres, that is absolutely ag. In addition to there being business operations that are much larger. I'm not saying that doesn't exist too. So I feel like what we're getting at here is trying to prevent the ag land from being paved over, as the previous speaker said, and there are a lot of different ways to go at it, but to keep an open mind about what could be on 10 acres. Sure, it could be a home where someone's not doing agriculture, but you absolutely, I think, could with the right conditions and the availability and the cost of land, which I think gets to the longer term questions of how do we reduce speculation so people don't always see that they're going to have to buy a land for their operation that's incredibly expensive, but that we have land that's being priced for agricultural use. Thank you.
Thank you. Larry, we'll start with you.
So on the size of the threshold, not only the size of the building, but also the outbuildings like a pool house and the garage and the work shed and all that other stuff include that. And the paving, if they have parking lots and tennis courts, all of that would take up the area. So maybe some aggregate of all those numbers.
It is, yeah. One thing we struggled with, we didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. What I mean to say is if you just said limit the size of infrastructure on the property, we didn't want to exclude barns and things that truly support ag use. And I think one indicator we have, it's really those larger homes, which leads to larger pools and others, which is a benchmark. But we can definitely look at not only the house size, but you'd say sort of residential accessory development with it and the size of that also.
And then also another question, on small farms, can't they do co-ops with several farmers get together and share a tractor? I mean, yes, you need a machine that was only practical for 20,000 acres, or 20 acres, but each of the 10-acre farms has it half the time.
Right, so that was one thought actually in response to the previous speaker. And actually, we know of a model, I think it's actually Mr. Mariani, who goes out and plants trees and cares for them on the back, say 2 to 3 acres of properties that have a house. So even if that property by itself, that's 5 to 6 acres, is hard to farm. If you design the homes to be in certain corners, a farmer could come in and farm the back 20 acres together.
And one other thing, you say they're legacy 10-acre lots. Is there any policy or process by which somebody could buy 2 or 3 of them and merge them back together? Is there any incentive to do that? Or I guess you'd lose a little bit of value, but could there be some incentive to do that? To merge things back into 20-acre lots?
Right. I can't think of an incentive. There's always an option to merge lots. Of course, it would lose in today's market its economic value, but nothing prevents that.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Supervisor Wasserman. A couple of questions and comments on the size thresholds, and I'm thinking in terms of your medium-scale zoning district with those legacy lots that some are down to 10 acres. And what I would not want to see is the size limitation preclude those parcels from participating in the Williamson Act. Williamson Act can be down to 10 acres in size on prime lands, and there is a size limitation that you describe in your report, a maximum of 10%, and that would apply to all hardscaping on that parcel. It might not be of interest to the current purchaser who might want to put up a large home, but if we're looking in the long term to preserve agriculture and viability, Williamson Act is a tremendous benefit, particularly for people who are buying property and getting a new factored base year value to that. They reap a far greater benefit than would a family that might have owned it for many, many decades. And what I wouldn't want to see again is having the development limit so great that it would preclude that parcel from participating in Williamson Act. And again, a 10-acre parcel under Williamson Act would allow 1 acre of development, 43,560 square feet of development. So in my mind, it's a reasonable number for a small parcel that's in an agricultural zoning district.
Thank you. Oh. Yep, please.
Are you referring to a 10-to-1 requirement, literally? I use that example of...
Yeah, well, under current Williamson Act...
I feel like I should know the answer to the question in our current Williamson Act, but if you could just clarify that.
Sure. Unless something has changed since the last 6 years or so, prime lands are, prime soils, Williamson Act, the minimum size is 10 acres to be considered in production. And there is a development limit for all hardscaping on that parcel. It's got to be compatible, it's got to be incidental, and that would include residential uses. And again, my concern is I wouldn't want to see that benefit to that parcel be lost because someone went over it, and it's hard for future owners of that parcel then to remove the development or somehow try to regain the benefits that could be gained from Williamson Act. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Supervisor.
But you're suggesting that 10 acres would have 1 acre maximum of ancillary development?
That is correct,
Got it.
of
Thank you.
hardscaping.
To stay in the Williamson Act.
To stay in the Williamson Act or to participate in the future. It may not be enrolled in Williamson Act now, but it could be in the future.
As a percentage. Yep. Laurel.
Thank you. Great. I'm so grateful that we're talking about all the land use items tonight, so thank you very much. And since we are talking about legacy parcels, one concept that didn't make it into the ag plan, and it's not directly related to the size limit, and I think you've got good comments on that, is really to add a future action item for planning staff consideration if it's acceptable to the board, and that is to consider the reversion of old subdivisions. So that way we get rid of some of these legacy lots. There is a provision in California subdivision law that allows for essentially what Mr. Ames was talking about, the merging of lots and to revert those old subdivisions. I know it's a lot of work, but it is a tool in the toolkit if we're serious about protecting agricultural land. Thank you.
Any other comments? Well, we can certainly receive the report, so I'll go out on a limb, make the motion to receive the report. Do I have a second for that really adventurous?
Sorry, I wanted to disclose there's still, I had paused at the first tool.
Oh, you're right, out of the 5.
There are actually more.
There are 4 more, you're right.
And so if you like, I can go ahead and keep going with the rest
Please.
of them.
Please. Do you have more questions now on this item? Oh, that's fine. Yes,
and I guess what I can do is I'll go forward. If you would like to stop on each one, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll just present. I'll keep presenting. I didn't want to break it up, but
let's go through all of them.
Thought there might be discussion on each, so I'll just keep going. Some of the other tools we're looking at, we do know that specifically in our agricultural medium scale district, currently the county allows certain types of land uses that'd be hard to say really support agricultural operations. In many instances, approving those to go in agricultural zones would result in more conflict with agricultural operations. In your report, we've listed about 7 or 8 of those. Some examples on the screen do include things like golf courses, commercial kennels, golf driving ranges, oil and gas. My recollection, I wasn't here when the general plan was adopted. It might have been an accommodation at the time for some pre-existing land uses in those areas. Over the years, we've only had a few proposals, but again, it's been our observation that approving these new land uses in ag districts oftentimes leads to more conflict, as there's really no direct relationship to supporting agriculture. So we could consider 1 or 2 modifications going forward. One would be just to limit or restrict these types of land uses, which again do not directly support agriculture, from being allowed in these districts. Or a softer approach would just be have much stronger findings to only allow these in areas where perhaps there would be no conflict, or have tools to limit the size, or some documentation that there is no agricultural use in or around the property. I think our sentiments would be to look harder at the first option, but there are 2 options in looking at this. I'll probably go through the rest of the tools, and then we can come back unless there's questions. Yes?
So yes, I'm interested in the thing about schools. I hear there's some district, there's a agricultural area surrounded by city most of the way. It's a small agriculture, and then there's plan for a school right in the middle of it, which would kind of ruin the whole area if you have the setbacks and so forth. I was wondering if can you change the rules though? If you suddenly say you're not allowed to have a school there, did that land lose its value? Is that a taking, or is this feasible to do?
Yeah, I mean, any change in land use, of course, someone would argue changes the potential value of the property. If we went through the zoning ordinance update, we'd make sure that the changes are protected from any sort of takings claim. But again, it would be, the intent of this is to prevent incompatibility with agriculture.
Because when you put a school, you kind of lose not only the land for the school, but the surrounding land around it, because you can't be farming right next to the school.
That's been our observation.
Thank you. Please continue.
Next one, agricultural buffers. On your screen is sort of examples where, to Michael's previous presentation, we have potential conflicts because houses or other non-agricultural uses were proposed right next door. Again, we have many case studies. Sometimes they contact residents, our office, the agricultural office, complaining about agriculture, and it's typically the farmer will set back their crops back from the property line to accommodate. This approach would instead require any new land use adjacent to existing farming to actually establish their own buffer to prevent that incompatibility going forward. There's some really good tools out there. They've been used in places like Yolo, Santa Barbara, a few other counties. The ranges that we've looked at are anything from 80 to 300 feet in distance. Another consideration is not just the distance, but establishing some sort of visual screen. Oftentimes it's viewing the agriculture or a buffering of the odors and establishing vegetation that helps. And so again, we're proposing for preliminary consideration, but with some more research, something like 100 to 150 feet in width on a new land use next to agriculture, incorporating and requiring vegetative screening. And again, this would be a good tool, and we know it's used now in Gilroy, but to have a tool that's used synonymously across the county in 3 cities. So pursuing this, we'd like to pursue a model ordinance that perhaps all 3 jurisdictions could adopt, to which anything adjacent to ag areas, city or county regardless, would have this buffering. On the bottom, I think, is an example from Yolo, and then on the top, also I think Yolo or Napa, kind of a nice distance between agriculture and adjacent residential land uses. Yes?
So who would maintain the buffer?
Good question. Typically, it would have to be the new developer that's required. Typically, if there's an HOA that's established, the HOA would be required to maintain that buffer.
And then if the adjacent farm later on changes and becomes non-agriculture, what would happen with the buffer? Would there be plans that it could be reused?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I haven't thought this all the way through. There could be some codifying ordinance that if for some reason the land use changed and agriculture was not there, it could be revisited. Typically, it's been the observation that if the agriculture is on the other side, it would continue, but that could be a qualifier that's added.
Please continue.
Next one, and I think a lot of our ag folks really like it. We talk about regulatory reform and streamlining, and we've observed that there are some areas where we could do some work. We've observed there's a lot of ag supportive uses for which the county planning department still requires use permits or other planning approvals for which perhaps not be necessary. These are really uses that are trying to support agriculture in the agricultural area. Oftentimes you use permit as a land use tool to look at compatibility, and if these are in ag areas supporting agriculture, really the need for that compatibility is diminished. So typical uses include ag tourism, right to farm, or farming dinners, having events in ag areas, ag worker housing, we're processing on our separate ever, ag processing, and things like farmers markets. What we're proposing, I'll go through these quickly, is taking a few of those ag supportive uses and streamlining them, either requiring a lesser permit or in some instances allowed by right. Just to walk the task force through these, if you need to get a use permit with the county, it's not an easy endeavor. I say that with all honesty as the planning manager. It's about $14,000 and requires a hearing before the planning commission, and typically it takes 6 to 9 months. We have lower level permits, special permits, one you see on the screen, architectural site approval, usually about half to a third that cost and take about half to a third that time. But especially the use permit is a long process. Again, it's really established to have neighborhood compatibility, that a use is not really going to impact the neighbors and the environment around it. Some of these uses you'll see on the screen, I'll just describe quickly. Agricultural sales, farmers markets, again, selling farming products. Entertainment events, agritourism, supporting things like farm dinners, small events to support agriculture in agricultural areas. Ag processing, of course, needed as part of the infrastructure when crops come out of the field. And I know some of you observed the Kiala operation, example of a large-scale processing that's integral to the food system. And some of these happen in ag areas. And then finally, agricultural research that are looking into new and different ways of looking at agriculture. So in all these instances, at least the first two, we do require use permits. Again, if you establish a farmer's market or do events in an ag area, and for ag processing up to large scale, at least for medium scale, we require permitting, and also for ag research. What the department is suggesting for a preliminary look at sort of reforming and permit streamlining, taking a farmer's market down at least to a special permit, which is a much lighter touch. Still look at some parking and adjacency issues, but not a planning commission hearing. In the ag entertainment, we actually did some regulatory reform about 7 or 8 years ago with our wineries. We allow certain uses by right. The intent was to support our wineries, allow ag tourism, give visibility to wineries. We'd like to use that same exact tool and apply it to the other agricultural areas. So if people are doing farm dinners and things like that, allow very small scale activities to happen without having to come in and get the use permits. And again, our wineries enjoy those privileges today, and we think it's been successful so far.
It has.
Ag processing, again, a very large scale would still be a use permit, but a smaller medium scale operation would be less allowed by right since it's in an ag area. And then finally, considering for ag research, a lower level permit, which would probably cut the time to review those by about half and the cost by half. Pause real fast if there's any questions.
No, keep on rolling.
Expansion of agricultural zoning districts. Again, we've observed there's some good farming operations and soils in some of our rural zoning districts that aren't zoned agriculture. This one's a really simple task. We're going to look a little bit harder on soils and farming. We actually are working with the Open Space District right now for a proposal to the state to change their designation in some of these lands to farmlands of local importance to at least recognize farming happens. After that effort, we'd like to come back, work really closely with property owners, adjacent cities, and see if some of these areas could be rezoned to agriculture. We realize in instances that if it's adjacent to cities and there's a different land use, that would take careful outreach with the cities. If it changes the allowed uses in a zone and perhaps subdivision and potential, it takes really careful consideration with property owners. But again, when de facto a lot of these lands are supporting agriculture and farming, we're thinking it's right to take a look at rezoning these to be agriculture.
Rob, I'm going to ask you to pause there just for a minute. We're going to lose Supervisor Cortese in just 5 minutes. So Supervisor, an opportunity to share your thoughts on all 5 items.
Right, I apologize. I don't want to set a bad example leaving early, but I have to go make a presentation on behalf of the county downtown at 7:15, so I'm going to have to leave. I appreciate all this presentation, at least what I've heard so far and studied so far. I want to go back to the 10 to 1 kind of a requirement on the first bullet on potential threshold as perhaps a good standard, at least a good starting point going in. I mean, it's good enough for the Williamson Act. Maybe it should be good enough for where we're headed with this, and then it's also consistent as well. But Supervisor Wasserman and I were just talking about, and everyone, there's farmers here and a lot of them out there still that aren't here tonight that would have input perhaps more valuable than mine. But I think I actually think it's more than generous. I can't imagine us on 40 acres or 50 acres having pulled out trees for ancillary buildings, to 4 or 5 acres on that property. We would have wanted to keep production up, unless we were trying to subdivide. And at 10 to 1, I just think it's more than generous, but at the same time it limits. It's basically telling you that 90% of your productive farmland is protected lot by lot. So hopefully that's at least a continued place for you to think about as you're considering bringing the stuff forward to the Board of Supervisors. The sales, the only other comment I want to make is the sale, back to this, for the buffers and some of the other stuff that's been discussed. I would go further on the special permit for sales from a cost recovery standpoint and just figure out a way to suggest the Board of Supervisors, or all suggested, that we just waive fees on an over-the-counter permit to do ag sales. I mean, if where we're headed is that we want ACEs, we want 12,000 acres preserved, and we want farm to table, I think charging people even $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, for a permit to sell is a little much. it's certainly not an incentive. You know, maybe it's doable. But I think we have to start thinking, especially in the early stages of ACE acquisition, of biting the bullet. And I know that's hard in your department. We have to figure out a way to do that with general fund augmentation. That's a whole different discussion budgetarily. But I'm not sure we want to pass, you know, even pass cost recovery on those permits. That's all I had on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, betcha.
Actually, I think we're at the end, so I'll go ahead and summarize. So just two last points, one small and one a bit larger. On timing, we do have our hands full a bit moment at processing. You'll remember back in April, a proposal to streamline agriculture housing. We actually had a workshop before our Planning Commission today. We're going to finalize that proposed ordinance, do outreach, and probably take it to the Planning Commission board in the next few months. And so for timing, we're proposing this to follow that. This would probably be in 2019. One key asset, it would be nice if the Agricultural Ombuds Program was funded. Someone's hired in that position would be a great resource to advise us as we go forward. And so again, just timing. Today was a preliminary discussion, wanted to get your feedback, but we'd probably start active work on the ordinance in 2019. Last but not least, so we know this issue was one that was intended by certain stakeholders for discussion, and this has to do with urban development and agriculture. And we wanted to have it before you and sort of the reasons why the County Planning Department's not putting it before the task force for any recommendations. So the issue, and you've heard this, is threats to agriculture aren't only actions that happen in the rural areas and the rural zoning districts. It's when cities are proposing annexation of agricultural lands. There's both a direct and indirect impact. Direct, of course, would be the annexation and development of the land. An indirect, and we've seen this in certain parts of the county, is when there's a specter of potential annexation. It causes land speculation to happen where land values are much higher, and farmers who farm that property aren't able to get long-term leases and put in infrastructure. We've seen this in areas like Cody Valley, around Morgan Hill, and some other areas where property owners perhaps are waiting for future annexation. If a city is proposing to annex an unincorporated area, first they would have to go through a general plan zoning to designate that area for annexation. The key decision-making process is through LAFCO, which I think most of the task force members know. LAFCO is required for an urban service annexation approval, which is the first step. LAFCO policies speak to orderly growth in terms of approving or reviewing and approving annexation. They speak to, can the city allow that development to happen in an infill area, and LAFCO policies also look at potential impacts to open space and agriculture. So the county general plan very much is in lockstep in terms of supporting those LAFCO policies. Again, our principles of general plan is to keep rural areas rural and keep urban areas urban. And again, of course, the intent of this ag plan is to do everything we can to support agriculture in those agricultural areas. We didn't put anything before you as a recommendation tonight. Again, this issue, of course, is a potential issue that affects agriculture, but it happens outside the four corners of the task force. As you know, the task force is a county-designated task force. We're here to look at county programs, county tools. Key drivers in urban annexation issues are the general plans of the cities and, of course, LAFCO policies. And if the county was to weigh in through a task force recommendation over the board, we think that's just a much broader stakeholder process and decision-making process that's beyond the scope of the task force. So I'll go ahead and summarize and be available for questions.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Mike. Any speakers on this item? Mr. Jacoby?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with Rob on facts. At least one city adopted with the county urban growth boundaries, 1994, 1996. It's both on both general plans. In that urban growth boundary, inside the growth boundary is explained in the general plans. It says within that boundary, within roughly 25 years, you can anticipate some form of development. Some of those parcels are in the county. Mariani's happens to be one of them. There are other ones that are totally surrounded, have been in that urban growth boundary. So taking a position otherwise is an inconsistency of your general plan. Under state law, that's a pretty general plan requirement of having internal consistency is very important. Some cities get in trouble when they don't have that. So there are sites right now that are anticipated, and typically they're ones that are surrounded. They're typically ones that have urban infrastructure right by them. They're ones that you've told landowners to give your land so the city can put infrastructure. Those are already in the general plans. In fact, if you read both of the letters from the city of Morgan Hill and the city of Gilroy, they raised that over 6 months ago or 10 months ago. What I would encourage you to do, in fact, been encouraging for a while, is let those two cities come in and explain that. Explain where they are in their general plan right now and those conflicts, so you can get a sense of the big picture. I mean, you've had people in from Sonoma, you had people in from Long Island. It strikes me it might be smart to have from the very cities that are affected by this plan. So you then making a decision, you've seen their letters, get their opinion as to how to handle those. Thank you.
Thank you, and the letters are part of the packet tonight. Laurel, we'll start with you.
Thank you, and again, thanks to staff for putting together all of these great ideas. So there's a lot here, and for the most part, I agree with pretty much everything that you've done. I think I'm just going to walk through the staff report and provide a couple of comments for your consideration. So on page 45, where we're discussing loosening regulations on agricultural supportive uses, totally agree we need to make it easier to do farm-to-table events and other events that really celebrate our wonderful agricultural lands. I would just caution that as staff is working on those loosening regulations, that you also be very clear about large-scale assembly uses and the things that you don't want to have happen in those areas. So silence sometimes can be interpreted as an allowance. So if you really don't want certain things to be happening, you may need to clarify that as well. And that then also relates to page 47, where you're talking about limiting non-ag uses in ag areas. I agree with staff that a restriction on some of those uses makes sense, and I would go so far as to say in some instances you might need to outright prohibit some of those uses. So again, there's a little bit of a fine grain there, but with additional staff resource, research, and then outreach, you might find that you do need to do some prohibitions as well. Turning to page 49, where we're talking about the timing of the modifications, I certainly appreciate the workload that the staff has. It's a comment I made at the last meeting. But I would say that these ordinance modifications are actually more important than having an ombudsman in place, because you might be faced with applications and requests sooner than later. So with all due respect, I would encourage that to move up in the timeline, since hiring and finding the right person might take a little bit of effort. And then with respect to the public comment about what's going on with the other cities, from my own experience, I know that each community has different rules for their urban growth boundaries. And I agree that this task force, it's probably not the right forum to really legislate and discuss what should happen where. But I would encourage that stakeholder engagement to happen sooner rather than later. I think there is a need for people around the table, the cities, LAFCO, the county. I think it's time to have that conversation. It's clear that there's a need for it. We got letters the email from Stan Ketchum from the city of Gilroy tonight. So I would say, you know, we should start that conversation now. I don't know where it would go, but I think framing it out and creating an opportunity for the convening and airing these issues out is going to be really important. They're here, and I don't think they're going to go away. But I also don't think it's the role of this task force to
Correct.
mediate or somehow legislate. Thank you.
Yeah, we're just creating work for planning is what we're here for. Yes. Aaron.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to go ahead and say a word of thanks to all the efforts by staff to go ahead and bring about this conversation in terms of trying to go ahead and make agriculture part of Santa Clara County, because we've been there for 2 generations right now, and right now I'm seeing the most changes go on that I've seen in all that time that I've been in agriculture for quite some time. So there's a big dynamic and a dynamic change for changing towards something other than agriculture. So I will go ahead and go out on a limb and say that agriculture is going to welcome all of the efforts that Santa Clara County is making. So I want to say thank you to Supervisor Cortese and Supervisor Wasserman to go ahead and advocate for that and push that forward, because right now there are changes going on in terms of ownership of properties, as well as changes in structural of growers in the area. So without any more explanations about that, I'd like to go ahead and bring that to attention. So these conversations and this effort right now is not too late, I don't think. So Kevin's remarks about keeping 10 acres within agriculture is appropriate. I think that any savior in terms of agriculture for Santa Clara County would be a boom, and hopefully we can go ahead and start a movement to have agriculture as a preserving aspect of Santa Clara County. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. I think this whole committee being formed, all of you spending these evenings together, bringing forth your experience, your passion, your concerns, is what we're all about here. We're increasing the awareness of agriculture, and planning, the 2 of you especially have led the effort from your point of view, not from your point of view, from your job, okay, is to bring forth to us ways in which we can do that. And it is so hard to be fair to everyone. And no matter what issues you bring forward, if you say 10 acres or 15 acres, 10% or 20%, you'll have people who are in favor, people who are opposed. The buffer zones, 100 feet, 150 feet, whatever. I agree entirely with Laurel as far as the cities of Morgan Hill and Gilroy being brought forth to the table. I see that as something next year down the road when we're looking at making some modifications, soliciting their input. And there is that overlap. There's the incorporated area, there's the unincorporated area, and there's this fuzzy area in between that both sometimes claim jurisdiction or ownership of urban service areas, urban growth areas, things like that. But you've really opened the door, and all of you being here, I have learned so much from this committee the last 6 months, so much more than I knew before, because of the unique perspectives that each of you have brought, the questions that you've raised. This particular item is simply to receive a report and provide feedback. And we're giving feedback. You're taking notes. Lizanne over there is taking notes. Okay, so this is all going, and Lizanne Reynolds is the county council rep staffing this meeting tonight. Thank you for stepping in and doing so. That works with our planning department to make sure whatever direction we go into meets all the required laws and concerns that we may have. We'll go right on down. Jane?
Thank you. I want to thank you for the report. A lot of good zeroing down into recommendations, and that's very helpful in terms of explaining and understanding. I also want to acknowledge how much I appreciate the regulatory reform. As someone who helps promote agricultural, ag tourism, ag events, and seeing how well it's working for the wineries in their particular scenarios, that we would adopt that kind of guidelines for the ag sales and the special related entertainment commercial uses makes a ton of sense. You know, why reinvent the wheel? So very good recommendation there. The other thing, as a member of the General Plan Advisory Committee for the City of Gilroy, we have a lot of work ahead yet. So we're not even close to making a recommendation to the city council on what's next for our 2040 plan. So that just gives you an idea of where we are. We can certainly ask the city to come forward, but we are right now waiting for several studies to be brought forward to the advisory committee. That will probably occur either late this year or early 2019.
Thank you, Larry.
Yes, you mentioned Morgan Hill and Gilroy. I'd also mention San Jose. I mean, they have a large incorporated area down there that has agricultural capabilities, the Coyote Valley, North Coyote Valley, and also east by Anderson Reservoir. So consider them too.
Absolutely. Okay, and I'll echo what Jane said, and perhaps what are our closing comments here. But we all worked together with the wineries that resulted in the allowed by right and the special permits and the streamlining process and reducing the time and reducing the cost. And when I read your report here, and one of your suggestions in your 5 bullet points does that with the allowed by right or the special use permit. You mentioned cutting time and costs in half or a third. All of those things are helpful. It's the red tape. You mentioned the $14,000 cost. You mentioned 6 to 9 months. I think a lot of people would love the 6 to 9 months because it often takes longer than that because we handle things in the order that they're received. And sometimes the workload far exceeds the staff capabilities. So I certainly want to express my agreement with anything that helps reduce red tape, not changes the result, but brings in some of what I would say is common sense, and I think many of you would share as common sense. But in that chart, Rob, that you showed, allowing at the very, very small level, allowed by right, it's a right that comes with the ownership of the land. And as it gets bigger, your responsibility increases, in which case a conditional use permit comes into play. So I appreciate your thinking and applying what we learned after a couple, 3 years of public outreach and a couple, 3 years of inviting opinions and testimony and to come in. What I think has turned out really, really well regarding the wineries of Santa Clara Valley. Do you have any other comments here at all? Okay. And as far as action goes, action is simply to receive a report and provide feedback. And if you all agree, we'll do it with a motion that the report has been received and you've provided feedback. Is there any other feedback to be provided? Okay, I'll make that as the motion. I need a second. Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, the motion is to receive the report and we have provided feedback. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. Rob, Michael, anything else you want to add in?
That's it. Very good feedback, and we got our work cut out for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Committee members, any other comments, thoughts, suggestions you want to make? Seeing none, we'll all meet here. I believe that's the Thursday after Thanksgiving, November 29th.
Last one. Yeah, really quickly, do have number 7. I just wanted to report the subcommittee's mostly been waiting on me, my apologies, to do a summary document and get them back together on our recommendations. And so we'll do that soon. Next month is our last meeting.
Excuse me, so you agree there is no report to receive, item 7?
There is no report to receive.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yep. And I just wanted to say, last month, just to set the stage, this is our sort of wrap-up meeting. We're going to bring back the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. We have some great ideas on short-term, long-term strategy.
Chocolate chip cookies?
That could be part of it. Locally grown, too.
Okay.
And I know Michael's going to bring back some signage concepts. I know you heard on the signage. And anyways, I just wanted to set the stage that our last meeting, we're going to come back to conservation easement, purchasing program, and signage, and we'll see you. It's the week after Thanksgiving, just so folks know.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you all. Drive safely. Meeting adjourned.